So we are still in domain number 3, security engineering, but we're going to wrap up our domain in the last few sections here talking about physical site security. Points of entry into the location, glass or windows, doors, other, data center considerations specific to things like uninterruptible power supplies and so on. And what are some of the things that we need to concern ourselves with when it comes to securing physical facilities? The first thing that you may want to do is survey the facility itself. Before the project takes place, we have to run an assessment to identify our operational plan. What are the practical approaches for securing our facility? So we'll do a grounds survey. We'll do a vulnerability assessment and risk analysis, just like we would with any IT-related system, but we would now start to consider physical security aspects, where the fences go, where the doors go, where the locks go, what types of physical construction material are we going to use, and so on. The security assessment is a comprehensive overview of the facility, including physical security controls, what are our access control policies and procedures, and life safety is always going to be a big consideration when it comes to physical security. Physical security meaning brick and mortar security, that type of thing. So employee safety meaning, is the parking lot going to have security? Are we going to have adequate number of fire extinguishers, fire exits, and plans in place to ensure life safety, and other things as well, right? Fire suppression systems, secure HVAC systems, and so on. A good assessment requires that the security professional has to determine specific protection objectives, including what are the threats that might exist, who are the targets, and what are the characteristics of the facility that would facilitate those types of threat vectors, right? This is no different than any type of risk assessment or risk analysis that we've done in the past. Identify the assets, right? Those are our target identifications in this particular case. Identify the characteristics of those assets. In this case, those characteristics might include strengths and weaknesses, vulnerabilities and protection mechanisms. And then who is the threatscape? Are we concerned about somebody driving a car through the lobby of our building, or potentially putting some sort of biohazardous material in the HVAC system, and so on? So we have to ask ourselves, what is the threat? And then we start to go down the list of those potential threats to the organization or the facility. What are we trying to identify? Always the same thing: likelihood and impact. Loss of life, loss of human life, obviously would be high impact. A window or a door being broken may be low impact, unless it's to gain access to something that's very secure. But stating the threats allows us to identify how adversaries impact the assets that we're trying to protect, and it gives us a way of mapping our strategy to protect those physical systems. So again, this is not any different than any other kind of assessment process that we would go through for an IT-related system. All right. What is the most valuable asset that has to be protected? Now, most people would classify that as human life, but if we're considering human life in a different category, it could be personnel, but it could also be property or equipment, or it could even be intellectual property or trade secrets or whatnot. But we need to identify the protected assets. We need to prioritize those assets, come up with some sort of risk matrix or threat matrix, of different terms to describe it, but essentially it's no different than what we saw previously. What is the probability, the likelihood, and what is the consequence, the impact? It's always about those two things when it comes to assessing risk. So something that has a medium probability but a very high impact might get more attention than something that has a low probability but still has a high impact. And again, this is in regard to physical assets, not technology or data and so on. So there are several things to look at from the standpoint of whether a facility is protected. Is it an existing structure that's been around for 20 years that may have some inherent weaknesses because building construction standards were different 20 years ago, or is it brand new construction? We need to review architectural drawings. We need to do a walkthrough of the facility, particularly if it's an existing structure. We walk through the facility. We have usually multiple subject matter experts involved in that. I mean, we're not architects. We're not civil engineers necessarily. So we may or may not be able to, on its face, identify some weaknesses or vulnerabilities, but maybe we need a subject matter expert or an engineer or a building engineer or, a contractor or whatever to kind of help us document and identify the technical aspects of that particular vulnerability. But walking that facility provides a static view, if you will, of how that facility needs to be protected. It's really just a matter of, identifying where your exits are, where your entry points are. If somebody was to try to do something bad, what would be the likelihood? So you might be walking around the building and saying, okay, here is our generator. The building was constructed 20 years ago, but the generator was installed last year. And the fuel depot or the fuel supply for that generator is not underground, it's exposed, and it's not secure. Or it might be installed, hopefully this wouldn't be the case if you were following probably construction guidelines and code guidelines, but it was installed next to the water supply. So if for some reason there was a breach in the fuel containment system, it could potentially contaminate the water supply for the facility. It would be those kinds of things that you would be looking for, not just, oh, this door doesn't have, a good lock, or there's no camera here, or, this window doesn't have any protection and it's ground level. Those types of things. You're certainly looking for that, but you have to really think of any type of threat vector. Is it a disaster, man-made disaster, natural disaster? Certainly direct attacks or assaults based on adversaries trying to gain access and whatnot. But the best way to build a comprehensive approach to protecting the facility is to do interviews, to do the walk around, to make a list of considerations for that facility. Oftentimes in construction, certainly we have contractors that participate in the construction of a facility, and they are following local, state, and federal guidelines for building code and whatnot. But building code is primarily there for life safety. It's there to ensure that the building is not going to fall down, somebody's not going to get electrocuted or injured in any way. Building codes are not there to provide security or to provide an assurance of security. So just because something is built to code doesn't mean it doesn't have some sort of vulnerability. What are some of our key security concerns? The facility security control during and after hours of operation, right? The doors may be unlocked during normal operations, but need to be secured after operations. We might have different personnel on site to monitor the facility after hours versus during our normal operation. Personnel and contract security policies and procedures need to be in place. We need to do personnel screening, not only for the employees that are working at the facility, but also for the contractors that we're hiring to protect that facility, right? We may not have a direct way of vetting contractors that get assigned, but we can vet the contracting agency, making sure that contracting agency employs appropriate screening methods internally. Obviously, site and building access control would be a consideration. Video surveillance, pretty common consideration. But video surveillance is only going to be as good as its integration into your monitoring and archiving capabilities. How many times have we seen, oh, we've got video of this guy breaking into our facility, but you can't really tell if the guy even has a face or not because the video system is not, it doesn't have night vision, or the video camera is such low quality that you might as well had a 3-year-old sketch the face of the person that was breaking into the facility. What are the protocols for responding to internal and external incidents? Notification protocols, your communication plan, your reaction plan, the degree of integration of security, and other building systems. Other building systems could be power, water, HVAC, and so on. What are the shipping and receiving security concerns? That's pretty important, right? Those are big doors that those trucks pull up to, and there's constant motion in and out of those doors. Not only for life safety, we need to concern ourselves because there's a lot of dangerous things that are happening, but it's a fluid environment where there's a lot of access taking place and so on. How do we identify assets within the organization? Asset management, asset tagging, and asset tracking. Proprietary information, how do we protect that? Computer network security, we've been talking about that the whole time. Workplace violence prevention. It is the responsibility of the employer to protect its employees, not only from external threats, but from internal threats as well. People get pissed off, they start fighting with each other, somebody gets injured or killed, the company could be held liable. Mail screening operations. We had those incidents previously where, suspicious white powders were being sent via mail to an office. What are the procedures for handling that type of thing? What are the recommendations? Parking lot security, also very important. You don't want your employees working a 12-hour shift and going home at 2 a.m. And going to a parking lot that has poor visibility and poor lighting and getting murdered or kidnapped or whatever. Because again, ultimately you want to protect your assets, which includes your personnel, but you also don't want to have, lawsuits and criminal prosecution because of negligence. Data center security, comms security, very important. How do we communicate telephonically, through radios and other communication methods, and how we protect that security. Executives can be a concern as well, particularly with organizations that have a very noticeable public footprint. Business continuity planning, evacuation procedures, etc. All right. So we do our vulnerability assessment. We assess the vulnerabilities within the context of the threats that we've identified and the value of the assets. Each element of the facility gets analyzed for those vulnerabilities, and then each threat and vulnerability pairing gets rated so that we can prioritize our resources to mitigating those risks. All right. The vulnerability assessment might change the value of the rating of the assets due to identification of critical elements or other factors that make those assets more valuable, right? The front entrance has a medium vulnerability. The receptionist has a high vulnerability. Not sure why they would classify receptionist as high, but I guess for social engineering and just because it's a person and not a thing, maybe, and so on, right? Now, this is just an example of how we might classify these assets. The ordinal scale that we use is completely arbitrary. It just has to be able to provide us the ability to qualify and quantify the assets that we have in our organization and how we're going to protect them. So vulnerability matrix is what we would create. You know, I'm not going to go through every one of these bullet points, but very high, high, medium, medium, low, low, very low. Again, this could be a numerical scale. It could be, you know, a written scale like this. The point is that you want to create some sort of threat/vulnerability matrix that allows you to allocate appropriately the resources that are necessary to mitigate those risks. And our risk appetite will generally be driven by this threat matrix. And we can kind of assume the same types of risk responses that we would saw before. Are we going to avoid the risk? Are we going to transfer the risk? Are we going to accept the risk? Are we going to mitigate the risk? What kind of compensating controls are we going to put in place? What kind of administrative controls, technical controls, physical controls, etc. are we going to put into place? Just because it's a physical facility doesn't mean that we don't basically follow the same steps that we followed before. All right.